What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. I love the Pokémon from the Hoenn region. It's still my favorite Pokédex to date, with by far the best balance of double and triple stage lines, pairings versus random one-offs, and of course, dual and mono-typed Pokémon. But obviously, some Pokémon don't need to have multiple types, so what if they were all like that? What if every Pokémon from the Hoenn region only had a single type? How would that affect their interactions with other Pokémon, and even their own relatives? Well, first up, it's actually the Trico line, who are already pure grass types, except for the Mega, I suppose, but we'll get to all of those later. So the first Pokemon for us to look at is actually Combusken, and I don't think it's too difficult to see why keeping it fire makes sense. It can gain some fighting attacks upon evolution, but it doesn't need to abandon the fire type to get them. However, Blaziken seems to be a different story. I would say that fighting fits this Kung Fu chicken better than fire anyway, since only its wrists flare up sometimes, and it could still easily beat the Trico line with all of the coverage moves that it's acquired in its previous stages. Marshtomp would also stay water, although it is much more of a coin flip than Combusken. However, Swampert will follow suit from the last time and turn into a full ground type. You might be scratching your head wondering why I would take a Sledgehammer to the starter-type trio, but they're typically a bit unbalanced anyway, at least when coverage attacks are included. Plus, imagine how cool it would have been for the starters to end up as totally different types. People would go nuts for that, with speculations of what the future could hold once this seemingly impenetrable line was crossed. At least until they reverted back to it in later generations, which is kind of a disappointment. The next one in line is Beautifly, who pretty naturally fits into the change of the flying type. It makes sense for it to now be defined by a trait that its previous stages couldn't do. And in that same vein, we'll have Dustox become a pure poison type, especially since there are only a handful of poison types in the whole region, meaning that neither of Wurmple's final evolutions share in its typing, almost making it like a new Eevee in a way. The Lotad line seems a bit odd, but I think it would work out if Lotad held on to the water type, but then its evolutions, Lombre and Ludicolo, turned into grass types. You might say that doesn't make sense, but you gotta hear me out on this, because the pure grass Seedot would turn into dark types with Nuzleaf and Shiftry, so they just kind of swap the grass type around, and then each of them would evolve with a stone based on only the first stage of their line. Personally, I think this only strengthens them as a pair. Next is Talo and Swellow, and you know the drill, these regional birds are just free flying types. But honestly, I think if any birds could have pulled it off before Rookidee allowed pure flying to even happen, we would have seen it on these sleek blue beauties. However, then there's Wingull, who I would also make into a flying type. Its body is approximately 80% wings anyway, and it is constantly gliding on the breeze even when it's indoors. And I think that would make Pelipper becoming a water type all the more powerful. Swapping to the water would intrinsically tie it to the sea, like it had soaked in so much of that salt water that it had no choice but to join in the depths with the very fish that it preys upon. The Ralts line comes next, and I think it and Kirlia should remain psychic type. I mean, they were perfectly fine as a single type to begin with anyway, but I think when evolving, Gardevoir should become a fairy type. I understand that fairy wasn't there when it was first introduced, but it would make it stand out from the previous stages as a boost in power of sorts. But of course, there will be even more obvious reasons for it as we go on in the future. Then we have Surskit, and as much as I would like water, I think it makes the most sense to keep it as the bug type. But hey, at least we have Masquerain to switch to a flying type. Listen, if there is one bug to be a flying type, it has to be this one. It traded in all of its legs for wings, so I don't want to hear any dissent in the comments like before. However, I will allow discussion on Breloom, because while its pre-evolution is grass through and through, I'm inclined to place Breloom in the fighting column. We already have cool grass types here in this region, and Breloom's style is heavily combat focused, so changing so much means that it has to have that change warranted in some way. Besides, it's a nice callback to the other mushroom line changing types when they evolved as well. The Nincada family is actually really easy. The base stage doesn't exactly display much connection to the ground type in any way, besides digging sometimes, I suppose, so pure bug works there. And then evolving to Ninjask would get you the flying type, while a free space in your party would net you a free ghost type in Shedinja. Sounds simple enough to me to have a trio of totally different typed Pokemon. Now, Azurill isn't quite as clear-cut because Marill turned into a water type, but Azurill doesn't have that as an option. So I'll just go with Fairy because honestly it never made much much sense for it to be the normal type in the first place, and Fairy works just as well as a base before the water takes hold of it. Then there's the little gremlin Sableye, and it should probably stick with the dark type. Its design and creepy mannerisms give off dark type energy, and they aren't even found around the other ghostly areas in the game, so I think the darkness Pokémon would be fine without the ghost type. Meanwhile, its counterpart has the perfect setup because Mawile already used to be a pure steel type. So let's just keep it that way and deny it from becoming a fairy type in Generation 6. Problem solved. And to keep that theme going, the Aeron line would of course lean to the steel type as well. It's not that I can't see them as rock, because I can, but they are like the Gen 3 poster children for the steel type, with it being coated all over their bodies, so I don't really think it needs any more rationalization than this, and we can just move on. Then there's Meditite, who I think makes sense to keep as a fighting Pokémon, and only once it evolves into Medicham would it take on the Psychic trait. Finally having all of that training and meditation pay off to reach that higher plane of new psychic powers. I think this is one of the more fitting type transfers across the franchise so far in this hypothetical rework. Roselia, I think, is a pretty easy grass type, even though it is a huge shame to lose any poison in a region with so few, but this living rose plant is just purely grass all the way down. As for Carvanha and Sharpedo, I'm actually going to say they should get the dark type. I know that they are fish, but as we've said, a Pokemon can live in the water without needing that type to survive, so a Pokemon can have gills yet be defined by something else, like the vicious malice running through the veins of these ocean predators. You might say that ruins the relationship to Team Aqua, but they don't really use mostly water types anyway. Besides, we're about to do the same thing with Team Magma, because Numel and Camerupt are going to be fire types. You could argue that Numel should be ground, but Camerupt is definitely fire. And we don't really want to lose any of those when they're already so sparse in Hoenn, despite having a volcano of all things. But we can offset that loss by keeping Vibrava a ground type. Honestly, the Vibration Pokemon looks nothing like a dragon anyway, and another flying ground type would be a pretty good way to have it diversify the element. And it's always good not to immediately abandon Trapinch. However, Flygon I think should change to be a dragon type. It would make sense to gain this feature only at the end of the line, making it a lot more powerful in the 11th hour. And actually this way it kind of draws a weird parallel to the Kingdra line, making a last-minute Dragon Edition an emerging pattern of sorts. Next is Cacturne, and I'll just leave him a grass type because he is just a big cactus, and we already had the opposite with Shiftry, so I think it fits. Now, whatever I said about Swellow being a flying type goes double for Swablu. I truly have no idea how this Cloudbird is not already a pure flying type. It's by far the easiest layup we've had yet. So that's what it'll be here, and like before, we will see Altaria take on the dragon typing, which helps to further set up that dragon type change as apparently a new standard. For Lunatone and Solrock, I have the idea to separate them and say that Lunatone should be a rock type, because it is just a big hunk of stone floating about like the actual moon, while Solrock will be given Psychic, because it is based on the sun, which is more ethereal in power as a giant ball of energy. That might have affected its initial design, but I still think that making this pair more distinct would benefit them both. Now with Barboach and Whiscash, I would say that they could remain ground types. Some mudfish being found in swampy areas makes sense, and actually Whiscash learns more ground attacks through level up anyway. So highlighting that part would give some variety to the ground type that they really need, a lot more than the water type needs to have a couple more fish. On the other side, we have Crawdaunt, who I would keep as a water type, since it lines up with Corphish before it, and like with Cacturne, we already saw another change to Dark, so I think that having one of each is a good way to go. Now for Baltoy and Claydol, it's fairly obvious that Psychic is the way to go. Yes, they are made out of clay, but Psychic-type Pokémon can come in all shapes and sizes, so their ESP allowing them to float is a much more defining trait to these ancient relics. Now, if you don't remember about the fossils before, we said that it would be best for them to not all be the rock type, otherwise it would be boring and you wouldn't need more than one anyway. So in Hoenn we have Lileep and Cradily, who would be grass types, while their counterparts Anorith and Armaldo will remain bug. That way the fossils will give you different things instead of just rock all the time, and it can actually make the decision on which one to take an important one. Then it's actually quite a long way down to the next one with one of my favorites, Entropius. And as much as I like its flying capabilities, the wings can exist on a pure grass type. They are made of leaves after all, so a giant plant dinosaur isn't something new for the grass type, but being able to fly as a passive talent is a pretty cool upgrade if you ask me. Then we find the Spheal family, and considering the shortage of ice types in general, I think it's in their best interest to be able to keep that one. Besides, they can live around the water and swim without having to be the water type. I mean, humans do it. Now for Relicanth, I would like to give them the Rock type, largely because we've already taken away so many of them, and it would be an even bigger conundrum adding to the mystery as to what this ancient Pokémon even is. However, the end of the Bagon line, Salamence, is a little bit tougher, since its lifelong dream was always to fly, so I feel bad for taking the flying type away, but at the same time, growing wings and being able to take flight should still be good enough. While Dragon tracks better with its design and station as a pseudo-legendary. The other pseudo-legendary of the region, the Beldum family, do benefit from the Psychic type, however, I think Steel is the more prominent feature for these iron legs to embody, and it would be a lot more fitting for Steven to use one in that way. But then we have the actual legendary Pokémon, so going down to Latios and Latias, I would actually split them as well, and give Latias the Psychic type, but Latios Dragon. I think having these twins be different types would help to justify why there are two of them in the first place, and actually provide a decision when picking between them like an Emerald. So it fits quite well to me for the Eon duo to represent opposite sides of the same coin. Of course, Rayquaza is one of my favorite legendary Pokémon, and he is unquestionably an amazing dragon, but it actually only makes sense for the sky-high Pokémon to be flying, because the whole theme of Hoenn is land, sea, and sky, so if the third member of the trio wasn't a flying type, it wouldn't even connect with the theme of the other two. And besides, this easily makes Rayquaza the coolest flying type so far. And the last dual-typed Pokémon from Gen 3 is Jirachi, who, I gotta say, never really made sense to be a steel type in the first place. There is nothing in its design or lore that would point to it being metal, other than it living inside of a comet or whatever, but shouldn't that make it a rock type instead? No, this Wish Granter fits infinitely better in the Psychic type. Plus, that makes it match the other Space Dweller that's right next to it. So, those are all of the Hoenn Pokémon if they were just a single type. We did seem to lose a fair amount of rock types, however, we also lost a significant portion of water for the first time, so that is quite a fascinating change, and I guess it means Team Magma is winning. And even though electric wasn't touched at all, it is still one of the smallest numbers in the roster. And I suppose that I just never paid attention to Psychic in the early generations, but it's still one of the strongest showings around, always near the top. So how would you classify all of the Hoenn Pokémon as a single type? Let me know down in the comments. Also, be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.